February 8th, 1944. The North Atlantic churned beneath HMS Starling's bow as Commander Frederick John Walker pressed his binoculars against the bridge glass, studying the grey emptiness ahead. His hands, weathered by 3 years of convoy duty, gripped the cold metal with practiced certainty. Somewhere beneath those angry waves, a German submarine was running for its life. The convoy, SL-147, had passed safely hours ago. 37 merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and ammunition to Britain's starving shores. Walker's second support group had shepherded them through the wolf pack, waiting in the western approaches. But one U-boat had lingered too long, and now it was paying the price. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant Commander Donald Wemyss, aboard HMS Wild Goose, had made initial contact at 0615. That morning, the sonar operator's voice had crackled through the radio with calm professionalism that belied the adrenaline coursing through every man's veins. Contact, bearing 090, range 1,200 yards, moving southeast at 6 knots. Walker's response had been immediate. All ships assume creeping attack formation. Starling will direct. Wild Goose, you're the hunter. Maintain absolute silence on approach. What followed was a tactical maneuver so unconventional that German U-boat command would never understand what killed their submarines. It wasn't speed. It wasn't overwhelming firepower. It was mathematics married to patience, wrapped in a doctrine that defied every instinct of aggressive naval warfare. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A standard depth charge attack required the attacking ship to accelerate to maximum speed, pass directly over the submarine's estimated position, and roll charges off the stern. The problem was fundamental. At 25 knots, a destroyer covered 400 yards per minute. Depth charges took 30 seconds to sink to 300 feet. During those 30 seconds, the submarine could travel 100 yards in any direction. Worse, the moment the destroyer's ASDIC sonar beam passed directly over the U-boat, contact was lost. The submarine disappeared from the attacking ship's instruments for critical seconds. A skilled U-boat commander learned to exploit this blind spot, waiting until he heard the destroyer's engines accelerate. Then, executing a hard turn the instant ASDIC contact ceased. By the time the depth charges exploded, he'd be 200 yards clear of the blast pattern. Captain Walker had studied the statistics with the obsession of a man who understood that numbers defined survival. British escort groups had been fighting U-boats since 1939. In those early years, for every 100 depth charge attacks, only 3 resulted in confirmed kills. 3%. 97 out of every 100 submarines escaped to attack another convoy, sink more ships, kill more sailors. The German submariners called it Wasserbomb roulette. Depth charge roulette. They learned to dive deep, below 600 feet, where water pressure created a protective cushion that absorbed explosion shockwaves. They learned to run silent, shutting down all machinery except essential systems. They learned to turn hard when they heard propellers accelerating above them. Walker had learned something else. He'd learned that the assumption underlying every depth charge doctrine was fundamentally wrong. Everyone assumed you had to attack fast. You had to race in, drop your charges, and race out before the U-boat escaped. Speed was survival. Aggression was victory. Walker believed the opposite. He'd studied anti-submarine warfare since 1918, when he'd served as a junior officer hunting German U-boats in the final months of the Great War. He'd spent the 1920s and 30s as one of the Royal Navy's few specialists in submarine detection, when such specialization was considered a career dead end. While his contemporaries sought command of battleships and cruisers, Walker had devoted himself to understanding how sound behaved underwater, how submarines moved, how human psychology influenced decisions made under pressure at 300 feet beneath a hostile sea. By 1941, when he finally received command of HMS Stork and the 36th Escort Group, Walker was arguably the most knowledgeable anti-submarine warfare officer in the Royal Navy. He was also 45 years old, far too old for destroyer command, passed over for promotion multiple times, and acutely aware that this might be his final chance to prove his theories worked. The theories were simple. First principle, a submerged submarine was not faster than a surface ship. Even at maximum underwater speed, a U-boat could barely manage 8 knots for short bursts before exhausting its batteries. A destroyer could maintain 25 knots indefinitely. Therefore, a submarine could never escape, it could only hide. Second principle, Aztec sonar could track a submarine accurately from 1,500 yards until the attacking ship was directly overhead. At that point, the physics of sound propagation through water created a cone of silence extending from directly beneath the ship down to about 300 feet. If a submarine was in that cone, it was invisible, but the cone was narrow. If you could guide another ship to the exact point where the submarine lay hidden in that acoustic shadow, that second ship could attack without the U-boat ever knowing it was coming. Third principle, and this was the insight that separated Walker from every other escort commander. Patience killed submarines faster than speed. A U-boat running submerged was burning battery power and consuming oxygen. Every hour that passed reduced its capability. Every depth charge that missed and exploded in its vicinity rattled its crew's nerves. If you could hold a submarine underwater long enough, force it to maneuver constantly, exhaust its power and its crew's endurance, eventually it would make a mistake. And when it made that mistake, you would be there, waiting with mathematical precision to exploit it. The creeping attack embodied all 3 principles. It required 2 ships working in perfect coordination. The directing ship, usually Walker's own Starling, would maintain Aztec contact from 1,500 yards, tracking the submarine's every movement. The directing ship would move slowly, at barely 5 knots, keeping its engines quiet enough that sonar operators could maintain continuous contact. It would announce its presence deliberately, letting the U-boat hear the steady ping of Aztec echoing against its hull. This was psychological warfare. The ping told the German crew they were being tracked. It told them their enemy knew exactly where they were. It created a constant, unrelenting pressure that wore down nerves already frayed by hours of silent running in a steel tube 300 feet below the surface. Meanwhile, the attacking ship approached from a different angle, running absolutely silent. No Aztec, no unnecessary machinery. Engines are dead slow, propellers turning just fast enough to maintain steerage. The attacking ship crept forward like a hunting cat, guided entirely by radio instructions from the directing ship. The U-boat commander heard only one ship, the one deliberately pinging him. He oriented all his defensive measures toward that threat. He listened for its engines to accelerate, prepared to turn when Aztec contact broke, calculating firing solutions for his stern torpedo tubes in case the pursuing destroyer came close enough for a desperate shot. He never heard the second ship approaching from his beam until depth charges were already tumbling toward him, fuses set to explode at his exact depth. By the time he understood, he'd been hunted by 2 ships, not one. It was too late. This morning, U-734's commander faced exactly that situation. He'd run deep, diving to 400 feet immediately after Wild Goose made initial contact. He'd turned hard east, then northwest, then south, trying to shake the persistent pinging that tracked his every move. He'd executed every evasion maneuver taught at the U-boat training school in Gottenhafen. Nothing worked. The pinging continued, steady and implacable. What he didn't know was that HMS Starling had positioned herself 1,500 yards astern, maintaining perfect sonar contact, while HMS Wild Goose approached from the submarine's starboard quarter in complete silence. Walker stood on Starling's bridge, watching the tactical plot being updated every 30 seconds by his anti-submarine warfare team. The U-boat was painted as a moving dot, its course and speed calculated from successive sonar echoes. Wild Goose was a second dot, creeping forward on an intercept course at 3 knots. The mathematics were unfolding with mechanical precision. At 0830, Wild Goose was 600 yards from the U-boat. Walker keyed his radio microphone. Wild Goose, steer 035, target depth 400 feet, Range 500 yards. Stand by for firing order. At 0840, the range had closed to 200 yards. Wild Goose, steer 040. Range 150 yards. Prepare to fire on my mark. The U-boat was still running southeast at 6 knots, its commander believing he was being pursued by a single ship that hadn't closed to attack range yet. He heard only Starling's ASDIC pinging steadily from astern. He didn't hear Wild Goose's propellers as the silent hunter positioned itself exactly where Walker directed. 0845. Fire now. Lieutenant Commander Wemyss gave the order. 10 depth charges rolled off Wild Goose's stern rails in rapid sequence, each one set to explode at 400 feet. The charges sank through cold Atlantic water, descending at roughly 13 feet per second. 30 seconds later, the first explosion hammered U-734's pressure hull. The submarine's commander had no warning. No acceleration of enemy engines, no loss of ASDIC contact signaling an attack run. Just sudden, catastrophic violence as 650 pounds of high explosive detonated 15 yards from his boat's starboard side. The first explosion buckled hull plates and shattered gauges. The second, 1 second later, ruptured a ballast tank and flooded the bow compartment. The third killed the chief engineer and destroyed the electrical distribution panel, plunging the submarine into darkness except for emergency lighting. Explosions 4, 5, and 6 merged into a continuous roar that threw men against bulkheads and rained shattered equipment on anyone not holding tight to something secure. The U-boat heeled over to 40 degrees, bow down, descending through 450 feet, 500 feet, 550 feet. The commander screamed orders that couldn't be heard over the sound of collapsing metal and rushing water. He'd been depth-charged before, but never like this. Never with no warning. Never with charges placed so precisely that his boat was at the exact center of the explosion pattern. He blew all ballast tanks, an emergency measure that would send the submarine rocketing toward the surface, but would also exhaust his ability to dive again. In his situation, with water flooding the bow and the pressure hull creaking under the load of depth that threatened to crush it like an aluminum can, surfacing was the only option besides death. U-734 broke surface at 0852, wallowing in the swells with her bow riding low and water streaming from ruptured venting holes. Her commander opened the conning tower hatch and found himself staring at HMS Wild Goose barely 400 yards away, with HMS Starling racing in from the other direction. The surrender took less than 2 minutes. The U-boat had no functional weapons, no ability to dive, and no hope of escape. Her crew of 56 men abandoned ship, climbing into life rafts while Royal Navy sailors watched from their gun positions. The submarine slipped beneath the waves at 0908, leaving only oil slick and floating debris. Walker logged it as kill number 1 for the patrol. Before the day was finished, there would be 2 more. The tactical innovation Walker pioneered seemed simple in retrospect. Use 2 ships. One maintains contact and guides the other. The silent hunter attacks without warning, but implementing this simplicity required training that bordered on telepathy between commanding officers, sonar operators with skill that exceeded anything the pre-war Navy had imagined, and a commanding officer willing to risk professional disgrace if his unconventional methods failed. Walker was that commander. Born in Plymouth in 1896, the son of a naval officer, Frederick John Walker had entered the Royal Navy as a cadet in 1909. He'd served on battleships and destroyers through the Great War, earning his commission and establishing himself as a competent, if unspectacular, officer. Post-war, he'd specialized in anti-submarine warfare at a time when the Navy viewed such specialization as proof you weren't good enough for more prestigious commands. By 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland and Britain declared war, Walker was a commander who'd been passed over for captain, facing mandatory retirement within a few years. His specialization had marked him as a technical expert rather than a fighting leader. The Royal Navy needed battleship captains, cruiser captains, destroyer flotilla leaders. It didn't need middle-aged officers, obsessed with sonar propagation and depth-charge geometry. Then, the U-boats began sinking British merchant ships faster than the British shipyards could replace them. In 1940 alone, German submarines sank nearly 4 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1941, the total exceeded 4.3 million tons. Britain was being starved. Every convoy that failed to reach port meant less food for civilians, less fuel for industry, less ammunition for soldiers. The Royal Navy needed someone who understood how to kill submarines. Walker finally got his chance. On October 15, 1941, he assumed command of HMS Stork and the 36th Escort Group, based in Liverpool. The group consisted of 2 sloops, 7 corvettes, and 3 destroyers, crewing ships that were supposed to escort convoys between Britain and Gibraltar. Walker immediately implemented a training regimen that his subordinate commanders found exhausting and eccentric. He drilled them endlessly on coordinated attacks. He created a code system where single words triggered complex maneuvers. Buttercup meant follow me in line astern. Raspberry meant form line abreast for a barrage attack. Pineapple meant the creeping attack, with ships designated by number to assume directing or attacking roles. His crews trained on ASDIC simulators, learning to distinguish between submarine echoes and false contacts from shipwrecks, whales, or water temperature gradients. They practiced loading and dropping depth charges until the sequence became muscle memory that could be executed in darkness, in heavy seas, under fire. Walker emphasized that every man in the escort group needed to understand the tactical situation. It wasn't enough for commanding officers to know the plan. Sonar operators needed to understand why they were maintaining contact from 1,500 yards instead of closing aggressively. Gun crews needed to know why they were holding fire even when a submarine surfaced 400 yards away. Radio operators needed to grasp the psychological warfare component of steady, deliberate pinging that told a U-boat commander he was being hunted. The 36th Escort Group's first opportunity came in December 1941, when they were assigned to escort convoy HG 76, 32 merchant ships traveling from Gibraltar to Britain. Intelligence indicated that a large wolf pack was forming to intercept the convoy. As many as 10 U-boats might attack. On December 14th, the convoy's escort carrier HMS Audacity launched reconnaissance flights that spotted multiple submarines shadowing the merchant ships. That night, the first attacks came. Walker's group responded with the tactics they'd drilled for 2 months. Instead of each ship attacking independently, they coordinated. When one destroyer made contact, others converged to assist. They maintained contact relentlessly, refusing to let submarines break away and reposition. On December 17th, Walker demonstrated his creeping attack for the first time in combat conditions. HMS Stork maintained sonar contact on a submarine, while HMS Deptford crept in silently from the flank. The coordinated depth charge attack destroyed U-567, the escort group's first confirmed kill. On December 19th, Walker personally commanded the destruction of U-574. This engagement demonstrated another of his innovations, ramming. When depth charges and gunfire forced the submarine to surface, Walker drove Stork directly into the U-boat's hull, crushing its pressure casing and ensuring it could never dive again. The submarine sank within minutes. By the time convoy HG-76 reached Britain on December 23rd, the 36th Escort Group had sunk 5 U-boats. The convoy had lost only 2 merchant ships and 1 escort, HMS Audacity. It was the first decisive convoy victory of the Battle of the Atlantic. Walker received the Distinguished Service Order in January 1942. More importantly, his tactics were studied by every escort group in the Royal Navy. The creeping attack became standard doctrine. What had been one commander's eccentric theory became the foundation of British anti-submarine warfare. But Walker wasn't finished refining his methods. In October 1942, he was promoted to captain and temporarily assigned to shore duty as Captain D. Liverpool, responsible for coordinating destroyer operations from the city's port. This posting should have been the capstone of his career, a prestigious administrative role before retirement. Instead, Walker used it to continue developing anti-submarine tactics. He worked with the training establishment at Western Approaches Command, using wargaming and simulations to test variations on the creeping attack. He developed the plaster attack, where 3 ships in line abreast would simultaneously drop depth charges in an overlapping pattern that made evasion nearly impossible. He pioneered the use of high-frequency direction, finding equipment to locate U-boats from their radio transmissions, then coordinate group attacks before the submarine realized it had been detected. In April 1943, Walker returned to sea in command of the 2nd Support Group. 6 ships built around HMS Starling, his new flagship. Unlike escort groups that shepherded specific convoys, support groups were hunters. Their mission was to seek out and destroy U-boats wherever they could be found. Walker finally had the tools and the authority to implement his vision completely. The 2nd Support Group became the most lethal anti-submarine force in naval history. Between April 1943 and July 1944, they sank 15 German submarines. No other group, British or American, came close to that record. Individual ships might achieve spectacular kills. Aircraft might sink multiple U-boats through superior technology. But no surface group, commanded by a single officer, matched Walker's sustained success. The secret wasn't technology. HMS Starling carried the same ASDIC sonar and depth charges as every other escort vessel. The secret was methodology married to obsession. Walker drilled his group constantly. He rotated commanding officers between ships so that every captain could perform any role in a coordinated attack. He established signals discipline that allowed complex maneuvers to be executed with single-word commands, reducing radio chatter that might alert submarines to their danger. He also understood the psychological dimension of submarine hunting. A U-boat submerged was a sealed metal cylinder where 56 men breathed recycled air and lived in constant fear of death from above. Every hour they spent underwater, their oxygen decreased and carbon dioxide accumulated. Every depth charge that exploded within a mile sent shock waves that rattled their boat and their nerves. Every ping of enemy ASDIC reminded them they were being tracked. Walker exploited this. He would hold contact for hours, deliberately not attacking, letting the submarine exhaust itself. Through constant evasive maneuvering, he would drop depth charges set deep, 400 or 500 feet, forcing the U-boat to dive even deeper, where water pressure strained every weld and rivet. He would maintain steady ASDIC pinging, that electronic heartbeat that told submariners their hunter hadn't given up, hadn't lost interest, was still there waiting for them to make the slightest mistake. Then, when the submarine commander's judgment was compromised by exhaustion and oxygen deprivation and terror, Walker would strike. The creeping attack would come with no warning. Depth charges placed with such precision that the U-boat's hull would rupture on the first salvo. German U-boat command never understood what was killing their boats. In the Western Approaches, they analyzed the few action reports from submarines that survived encounters with Walker's group. The reports described an enemy that never attacked in predictable patterns, that maintained contact far longer than any escort should invest in a single submarine, that somehow always knew exactly where the U-boat was, even when it changed depth and course repeatedly. Some German commanders speculated the British had developed new sonar that could track through the acoustic shadow zone directly beneath attacking ships. Others believed the Royal Navy was using psychics, mind readers who could sense submarine positions through paranormal means. The truth was simpler and more devastating. They were fighting an opponent who understood their capabilities better than they understood themselves, who had trained his crews to execute tactics no other group could manage, and who possessed the patience to hunt submarines until they had nowhere left to run. Now, on this cold February morning in 1944, Walker was demonstrating those tactics again. U-734 had been the first kill. At 10:45, HMS Wild Goose made contact on U-762, running deep southeast of the convoy track. The creeping attack lasted 2 hours and 18 minutes. Walker maintained contact while Wild Goose crept in for the kill. When the depth charges exploded at 0:13:05, the second U-boat of the day disappeared in a massive underwater detonation that sent debris and oil to the surface. 2 submarines in 7 hours. But Walker wasn't satisfied. Intelligence indicated at least 3 U-boats were operating in this area. There would be a third. The third contact came at 15:35, just as the pale winter sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. HMS Magpie's sonar operator detected a submarine running deep, approximately 8 miles from where U-762 had been destroyed. The signal characteristics suggested a Type 7C U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet. 56 men were sealed inside that steel cylinder, unaware they'd just been marked for death. Walker studied the tactical plot with eyes that hadn't seen sleep for nearly 18 hours. His operations officer, Lieutenant Commander Alan Byrne, stood beside him on Starling's bridge, watching his captain calculate angles and probabilities with the practiced efficiency of a mathematician solving equations. "This one's running smart," Walker observed quietly, "deep and slow. He's heard what happened to the others. He knows we're hunting." The U-boat was at 500 feet, moving at barely 3 knots, trying to minimize the acoustic signature that sonar operators use to track submarines. At that depth and speed, he was nearly invisible to standard detection methods. But Walker's group didn't use standard methods. "All ships assume creeping attack formation," Walker ordered. Starling directing. "Kite, you're the hunter this time. Maintain absolute silence. Magpie, continue tracking, but reduce ping rate to once every 30 seconds. Let him think we've lost interest." This was psychological warfare again. The U-boat commander heard Magpie's sonar pinging, tracking him accurately. Then the ping rate decreased, 30-second intervals instead of continuous contact. The German captain's tactical training told him this meant the British were losing confidence in their contact, that he was succeeding in evading detection. What he didn't know was that HMS Kite was already moving into position, running silent at 4 knots, guided entirely by radio instructions from Starling. Walker maintained the overall tactical picture, coordinating 3 ships in a ballet of death that required split-second timing and absolute trust between commanders. The hunt lasted 3 hours and 25 minutes. The U-boat twisted and turned, changing depth from 500 feet to 600 feet and back, executing evasion patterns that should have broken sonar contact. But Walker anticipated every move. He'd studied captured German tactical manuals. He'd interrogated U-boat prisoners. He understood their doctrine better than some of their own officers. At 18:55, with darkness settling over the Atlantic and visibility dropping to half a mile, Walker gave the order. "Kite, fire now. Range 60 yards. Target depth 520 feet. HMS Kite dropped 14 depth charges in rapid sequence. The first explosion caught U-734's stern section, rupturing the propeller shaft seals and flooding the engine room. The second and third charges exploded simultaneously against the pressure hull amidships, buckling steel plates inward and destroying the submarine's main electrical systems. The U-boat broke surface at 19:02, listing heavily to starboard, unable to dive, taking water through multiple hull breaches. Walker watched through binoculars as the conning tower hatch opened and German sailors began abandoning ship. 18 survivors made it into the water before the submarine slipped beneath the waves at 19:08. 3 U-boats in 15 hours. It was unprecedented. No escort group in the Royal Navy, in any navy, had ever achieved such concentration of kills in such a brief period. Walker logged the engagement with characteristic understatement. U-734 destroyed at 19:08. 18 prisoners recovered. Group continuing patrol. But the human cost of this success was beginning to show. Starling's crew had been at action stations for nearly 20 hours. Men were functioning on adrenaline and corned beef sandwiches, sustained by hot cocoa and the knowledge that their captain's tactics worked. Walker himself hadn't left the bridge, except for brief visits to the chart room. His uniform was stained, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes remained sharp, constantly scanning the horizon for the next threat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The patrol had begun on January 29, 1944, when the 2nd Support Group departed Liverpool with orders to protect convoys in the western approaches and actively hunt U-boats operating southwest of Ireland. The group consisted of 6 sloops: HMS Starling, Walker's flagship; HMS Wild Goose, under Lieutenant Commander Donald Wemyss; HMS Kite, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Fillell; HMS Magpie, under Lieutenant Commander Herbert Baisley; HMS Woodpecker, commanded by Commander Hugh Baisley; and HMS Wren, under Lieutenant Commander Rodney Arbuthnot. These were not destroyers. Sloops were smaller, slower ships, designed specifically for convoy escort and submarine hunting. They displaced only 1,400 tons compared to a destroyer's 2,000 tons. Their maximum speed was 20 knots instead of 35, but they carried extensive anti-submarine equipment: ASDIC sonar, depth charge racks capable of holding 160 charges, and most importantly, for Walker's tactics, the crew, training and command coordination that made complex maneuvers possible. The group also included 2 escort carriers, HMS Activity and HMS Nirana, providing air cover that could spot surfaced submarines and force them underwater where ASDIC could track them. This combined surface-air approach represented the evolution of anti-submarine warfare from the desperate improvisation of 1940 to the professional, coordinated killing machine of 1944. The first kill had come on January 31st. HMS Wild Goose made contact on U-592 northwest of the patrol area. The submarine was running at 400 feet, executing standard evasion patterns. Walker directed a creeping attack that lasted 47 minutes. When Wild Goose's depth charges exploded at 0935, U-592 imploded, killing all 52 men aboard. No survivors, no wreckage beyond an oil slick and some wooden debris. For the next week, the group escorted convoys through increasingly dangerous waters. German Naval Command had positioned multiple wolf packs in the western approaches, attempting to intercept the steady stream of merchant ships carrying food and fuel to Britain. Walker's group shadowed these convoys at a distance, ready to reinforce any escort that made contact with enemy submarines. On February 8th, HMS Woodpecker detected U-762 at first light. The submarine was attempting to position itself ahead of convoy SL-147-37 merchant ships bound for Britain. Walker directed Woodpecker and HMS Starling in a coordinated attack. The engagement lasted 2 hours before depth charges forced the submarine to surface. It sank at 0815 with no survivors among its crew of 56. Then came February 9th, the day that would define Walker's career and establish the record that still stands. 3 U-boats destroyed in 15 hours through tactical excellence that German submarine command would never comprehend. The 4th kill came 2 days later on February 11th. HMS Wild Goose and HMS Woodpecker tracked U-424 for 6 hours before forcing it to the surface. The submarine attempted to fight back, its deck gun crew emerging to man the 88mm cannon mounted forward of the conning tower. It was a desperate, futile gesture. HMS Wild Goose's 4-inch guns destroyed the deck gun before it could fire, killing the gun crew and forcing the remaining sailors to abandon ship. The 5th kill occurred on February 19th. U-264 was detected by HMS Woodpecker running deep southwest of the patrol area. Walker directed a 7-hour hunt that exhausted the submarine's batteries and air supply. When it surfaced at 1645, Walker ordered his ships to hold fire, allowing the German crew to abandon ship before depth charges sent the submarine to the bottom. This was not mercy. This was calculation. Living prisoners could be interrogated, providing intelligence on German submarine tactics, equipment capabilities, and morale. Dead Germans provided nothing except confirmation of a kill. The 6th and final kill of the patrol came on February 20th, but it came at a cost. HMS Woodpecker was tracking a contact when a Gnat torpedo, a German Navy acoustic torpedo designed to home in on the sound of ship propellers, struck her stern at 1835. The explosion destroyed her rudder and propeller, leaving her dead in the water. For 7 days, Walker's group attempted to tow the crippled sloop back to Britain. On February 27th, a fierce Atlantic storm finished what the torpedo had started. HMS Woodpecker capsized and sank, but every member of her crew survived, rescued by the other ships in Walker's group. Not one man lost despite the ship's destruction. And the second support group arrived back at Liverpool on February 25th to a reception that bordered on hysteria. The docks at Gladstone Dock in Bootle were crowded with thousands of people, merchant seamen whose convoys Walker had protected, women whose husbands and sons served in the Atlantic, dock workers who understood what 6 U-boats destroyed meant for Britain's survival. The First Lord of the Admiralty, A.V. Alexander, was present to greet Walker personally. The captain was promoted, his seniority backdated from June 30th, 1942 to June 30th, 1940, acknowledging that his earlier lack of promotion had been the Navy's mistake, not his failure. He was awarded a second bar to his Distinguished Service Order. But the statistics told the real story. In 27 days, Walker's group had sunk 6 U-boats. During that same period, 12 large Atlantic convoys had reached Britain safely. The German submarine offensive that had nearly starved Britain into surrender in 1942 was collapsing under the weight of tactical innovations pioneered by commanders like Walker. The mathematics were brutal for German submariners. In May 1943, 43 U-boats had been sunk in a single month, a casualty rate of 25% of Germany's operational submarine force. U-boat command called it Black May, the turning point when Allied anti-submarine warfare became so effective that continuing the submarine campaign was essentially sending crews to certain death. By February 1944, when Walker completed his record-breaking patrol, German U-boats were being destroyed faster than shipyards could replace them. The average operational life of a U-boat commissioned in 1944 was less than 3 months. The average U-boat crewman had a 75% chance of dying before the war ended. Walker's tactics were the primary reason for this transformation. The creeping attack that he'd pioneered and refined had been adopted throughout the Royal Navy and taught to American escort groups operating in the Atlantic. What had been one eccentric captain's theory in 1941 was now standard doctrine taught at every anti-submarine warfare school. But tactical innovation alone doesn't explain Walker's success. The man himself was essential to the equation. He possessed an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on compulsion. Every engagement was analyzed, every depth charge pattern studied, every sonar contact examined for lessons that could improve future attacks. He drilled his group relentlessly. Between patrols, when other escort groups rested in port, Walker's ships conducted training exercises. They practiced coordinated maneuvers until commanding officers could anticipate each other's actions. They ran sonar operators through simulations until they could distinguish between submarine echoes and false contacts with near-perfect accuracy. Walker also understood human psychology in ways that transcended naval tactics. He knew that submarine warfare was fundamentally a battle of nerves. A U-boat commander at 500 feet beneath an angry sea, listening to depth charges exploding in the distance, feeling shockwaves rattle his boat, hearing the steady ping of enemy sonar tracking his every move. That commander was fighting exhaustion, fear, and oxygen deprivation simultaneously. The longer Walker could hold a submarine underwater, the more its commander's judgment deteriorated. Fresh air recycled through carbon dioxide scrubbers became stale and oxygen depleted. Battery power decreased with every hour spent evading at high speed. The psychological pressure of knowing you were being hunted by an enemy who refused to give up wore down even veteran crews. Walker exploited this ruthlessly. He would maintain contact for 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours if necessary. He would drop depth charges at regular intervals, never close enough to destroy the submarine, but always close enough to remind its crew they were trapped. He would ping steadily with Aztec, that electronic heartbeat that told submariners their enemy knew exactly where they were. Then, when the U-boat commander was exhausted and desperate and making decisions compromised by oxygen deprivation, Walker would strike with the creeping attack. No warning, perfect placement, overwhelming force. German submarine commanders never learned to counter this tactic because they never understood its psychological component. German tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive maneuvering and bold action. Their training taught them that speed and decisiveness would break enemy contact. They didn't understand that they were fighting an opponent who viewed submarine hunting as a marathon, not a sprint, who possessed the patience to track them until they made inevitable mistakes. The personal cost of Walker's obsession was beginning to show by February 1944. He was 47 years old, ancient by destroyer command standards. 3 years of nearly continuous combat duty had worn him down physically and mentally. He rarely slept more than a few hours per night, even in port. He ate irregularly, surviving on sandwiches and cocoa during engagements that lasted days. His family life had been strained by the war. His wife, Eileen, and their children lived in relative safety while he hunted submarines in the North Atlantic. Communication was irregular, limited to brief letters when ships reached port. The psychological burden of commanding men in combat, knowing that his decisions determined whether they lived or died, weighed heavily despite his outward confidence. In August 1943, Walker had received devastating news. His eldest son, Sub-Lieutenant Timothy Walker, had been killed when his submarine HMS Parthian struck a mine in the Mediterranean. The official notification arrived months after the actual event due to wartime communication delays. Walker learned that his son had been dead for nearly a year while he'd been hunting submarines in the Atlantic. He never spoke publicly about this loss. His contemporaries noted that he seemed more driven. After receiving the news, more focused on destroying U-boats, less willing to accept any outcome except complete annihilation of every submarine his group contacted. Some speculated that he was working through grief by channeling it into professional excellence. Others believed he was slowly burning himself out through sheer force of will. In March 1944, Walker's group provided escort for Arctic convoy JW-58, 49 merchant ships carrying war materials to the Soviet Union through some of the most dangerous waters in the world. And German U-boats, surface raiders, and aircraft all threatened these convoys. The weather was brutal, with sub-zero temperatures, heavy seas, and pack ice that could crush ships if they were trapped. Walker's group sank one U-boat on the outward journey and delivered every merchant ship safely to Murmansk. The return journey was equally successful. Not a single ship was lost. Soviet authorities, not known for praising Western allies, specifically commended Walker's tactical skill in protecting the convoy. On June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy began. Operation Neptune, the naval component of D-Day, involved nearly 7,000 vessels, transporting 150,000 troops across the English Channel. German Submarine Command positioned 76 U-boats to intercept and destroy this invasion fleet. Walker's second support group was assigned to protect the western approaches to the Channel, creating a barrier between German submarine bases in France and the vulnerable transport ships. For 2 weeks, Walker's group patrolled aggressively, investigating every sonar contact, forcing U-boats underwater and holding them there until the invasion forces had passed. Not a single U-boat penetrated Walker's defensive line. German submarines attempting to reach the invasion fleet were either destroyed or forced to abort their missions. The historical record shows that U-boats caused minimal casualties during the Normandy invasion, a testament to the effectiveness of Allied anti-submarine warfare. But the physical and mental cost of this success was destroying Walker. He remained on duty continuously during the 2-week Normandy patrol, refusing to rest while his ships were engaged in combat operations. He pushed himself beyond reasonable limits, sustained by determination and the knowledge that failure would mean Allied soldiers dying on the beaches. On June 13th, 1944, Walker was awarded a third bar to his Distinguished Service Order, an extraordinary recognition that placed him among the most decorated officers in the Royal Navy. The citation read, "For outstanding leadership, skill and determination in HMS Starling, Wild Goose, Kite, Woodpecker, and Magpie, in the destruction of 6 U-boats in the course of operations covering the passage of convoys in the North Atlantic." Walker's final patrol began on May 5, 1944, when his group sank U-473 using the creeping attack method that had become his signature. It would be his last confirmed kill. 20 U-boats destroyed under his direct command over 3 years of nearly continuous combat operations. No other Allied commander, British or American, matched that record. On July 7, 1944, Walker returned to Liverpool and received 2 letters from the Admiralty. The first officially confirmed what he'd suspected for nearly a year. His son Timothy had been killed in action in August 1943. The second letter ordered the second support group to prepare for immediate departure on another patrol. That evening, Walker felt unwell and reported to the Royal Naval Hospital in Seaforth. Doctors diagnosed a cerebral thrombosis, a blood clot in the brain caused by sustained stress, exhaustion, and hypertension. 2 days later, on July 9, 1944, Captain Frederick John Walker died. He was 48 years old. His funeral was held at Liverpool Cathedral with full naval honours. More than 1,000 people attended. A naval procession carried his coffin through the streets of Liverpool to the pierhead, where it was placed aboard the destroyer HMS Hesperus for burial at sea. Most of the sailors manning the funeral procession were from the Royal Canadian Navy, as Walker's own group had already departed on patrol. The official cause of death was listed as cerebral thrombosis, but everyone who'd served with Walker understood the truth. He'd died from exhaustion, from 3 years of combat operations that would have broken most men in months, from the relentless pressure of commanding men in battle and knowing that every decision carried life or death consequences. Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister, had once said that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril, the threat that German submarines would sink so many merchant ships that Britain would be starved into surrender. That threat was defeated by many factors: improved technology, better intelligence, American industrial capacity, and the courage of merchant seamen who continued sailing despite horrific casualty rates. But individual commanders like Frederick John Walker played an irreplaceable role. His tactical innovations transformed anti-submarine warfare from desperate improvisation into professional killing machine. His creeping attack became doctrine taught to every escort group in the Allied navies. His emphasis on coordinated group tactics, patient tracking, and psychological warfare against submarine crews established principles that remain relevant in modern naval warfare. The 27-day patrol, from January 29th to February 25th, 1944, represented the pinnacle of Walker's career. 6 U-boats destroyed, including 3 in 15 hours on February 9th. 12 convoys protected, hundreds of merchant ships delivered safely, thousands of tons of food, fuel, and ammunition reaching Britain. But the patrol also represented the cost of such achievement. Walker pushed himself and his crews to limits that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. The obsessive attention to detail, the refusal to rest during operations, the psychological burden of command in combat, all of these extracted a price that would ultimately kill him. German Submarine Command never understood what made Walker's group so deadly. They analyzed survivors' reports and tried to identify the technical advantage that allowed his ships to track U-boats so accurately. Some German officers speculated about secret sonar equipment. Others believed the British had broken German naval codes and were reading U-boat communications. The truth was simpler and more devastating. They were fighting a commander who understood their capabilities better than they understood themselves, who'd spent years studying submarine tactics and psychology, who'd developed attack methods specifically designed to exploit German doctrine's weaknesses. The creeping attack worked because it contradicted every assumption underlying German anti-submarine warfare training. German submariners were taught that escorts attacked aggressively, accelerating to maximum speed and losing sonar contact in the final approach. The creeping attack eliminated that blind spot by using two ships, one maintaining continuous contact while the other attacked silently. German commanders were trained to listen for changes in enemy propeller sounds, to anticipate the moment when an escort accelerated for attack. The creeping attack's silent hunter approached at barely 4 knots, propellers turning so slowly they were nearly inaudible beneath normal ocean background noise. German tactical doctrine emphasized bold maneuvering and aggressive evasion. The creeping attack exploited this by maintaining contact for hours, allowing the submarine to exhaust itself through constant maneuvering, then striking when the crew was too tired and oxygen-deprived to respond effectively. Walker's success proves that in warfare, tactical innovation and psychological understanding can overcome technical limitations. His ships carried the same equipment as every other Royal Navy escort. They weren't faster, more heavily armed, or technologically superior. The difference was methodology, training, and a commanding officer who understood that submarine hunting was as much about breaking enemy morale as about delivering explosive charges to correct depths. The legacy of Walker's 27-day patrol extends far beyond the 6 U-boats destroyed. It demonstrated that escort groups could transition from defensive convoy protection to offensive submarine hunting. It proved that coordinated tactics could achieve results impossible for individual ships. It established that patient, methodical approaches could be more effective than aggressive attacks. Modern anti-submarine warfare still uses principles Walker pioneered. Multi-ship coordination, silent stalking, psychological pressure on submarine crews, all of these remain fundamental to hunting submarines in the 21st century. The technology has changed dramatically, with satellites and advanced sonar replacing ASDIC and visual sightings, but the underlying tactical concepts trace directly to Walker's innovations. In 1998, a statue of Captain Frederick John Walker was unveiled at Liverpool's Pier Head, overlooking the River Mersey. The bronze sculpture depicts him in his characteristic pose, binoculars in hand, scanning the horizon for threats, alert and vigilant. The statue faces westward, toward the Atlantic, toward the waters where he fought his greatest battles. The inscription reads, Captain F.J. Walker, C.B. DSO, 1941 to 1944, the most successful anti-submarine commander of the Second World War. The simple memorial doesn't capture the complexity of the man, the obsessive dedication that drove him to excellence, the psychological toll that command extracted, or the tactical genius that transformed naval warfare. But it preserves his memory for generations who never experienced the desperate struggle of the Battle of the Atlantic, who cannot comprehend what it meant when Churchill said the U-boat peril was the only thing that frightened him, who live in a world where British children don't face starvation because merchant convoys reach port safely. Walker's 27-day patrol in early 1944 represented more than tactical success. It symbolized the turning point when Allied anti-submarine warfare became so effective that continuing the U-boat campaign meant sending German crews to certain death. It marked the moment when Britain's survival was assured, when the threat of starvation through blockade finally ended. The 6 U-boats destroyed during that patrol, U-592, U-762, U-734, U-762, U-424, and U-264, carried a combined crew of 336 men. Most died in the initial explosions. A few survived to be pulled from the frigid Atlantic water. They became prisoners of war, eventually returning to Germany to find their country defeated and their navy destroyed. But their sacrifice, like the sacrifice of thousands of German submariners who died in the Atlantic, was not meaningless from a historical perspective. The U-boat campaign despite its ultimate failure, demonstrated the potential of submarine warfare and influenced naval doctrine for decades. The tactical lessons learned by both sides shaped Cold War submarine operations and continue to inform modern naval strategy. Walker's counter to that campaign, his development of the creeping attack, and his emphasis on coordinated group tactics, represented an equally important contribution to military history. He proved that asymmetric warfare could be defeated through innovation rather than overwhelming force, that tactical creativity could overcome enemy advantages, that patient methodology could achieve results impossible through aggressive action. The narrow lane of the Western approaches still exists, though modern cargo ships crossing the Atlantic follow routes determined by GPS rather than wartime necessity. No markers identify where U-592 imploded or where U-734 surrendered. The cold Atlantic waters preserve no memory of the men who died there. German submariners and British sailors whose final resting place is the seafloor, thousands of feet below. But history remembers, recorded in Admiralty reports and personal memoirs, in tactical analyses and naval doctrine, in the statistics that show how the Battle of the Atlantic was won through patience and innovation rather than brute force. It remembers that between January 29th and February 25th, 1944, one British captain commanded 6 ships that destroyed 6 German submarines, including 3 in a single 15-hour period that established a record never matched. It remembers Captain Frederick John Walker, who understood that courage sometimes requires patience rather than aggression, that wisdom comes from studying your enemy until you understand their capabilities better than they do, and that the difference between tactical brilliance and failure often reveals itself only in hindsight, measured in lives saved rather than battles won. The 27-day patrol teaches us that warfare's arithmetic extends beyond firepower and technology to include human judgment, tactical innovation, and the ability to maintain focus under conditions that would break ordinary men. Walker saw what others missed, developed tactics that others couldn't execute, and pushed himself beyond reasonable limits in service of his mission. His story is one of triumph and tragedy intertwined. He achieved what no other anti-submarine commander accomplished, establishing records that remain unbroken 8 decades later. But that achievement cost him everything: his health, his time with family, and ultimately, his life. He died, knowing he'd won his war, but never seeing the peace his victories made possible. The 6 U-boats sunk during the 27-day patrol were more than tactical victories. They were symbols of the turning tide, evidence that German submarine warfare had been defeated, proof that Britain would survive and eventually prevail. Walker's methods ensured that merchant convoys reached port, that food reached civilians, that ammunition reached soldiers, that the lifeline connecting Britain to America remained open. In the grand, strategic narrative of World War II, Walker's patrol was a small engagement in one theater of a global conflict. But for the men who served in his group, for the merchant seamen whose convoys he protected, for the British civilians who didn't starve because supplies reached port, his tactical genius made the difference between survival and defeat. The mathematics were always brutal. 6 U-boats destroyed meant 336 German sailors dead. But those 6 submarines would have sunk dozens of merchant ships if they'd remained operational, killing hundreds of Allied sailors and destroying thousands of tons of crucial supplies. Walker's success, measured in enemy killed, translated directly into British lives saved. This was the reality of submarine warfare in the North Atlantic. Every tactical decision carried life or death consequences. Every engagement was a mathematics problem where the solution was measured in casualties rather than numbers. Walker excelled at this grim arithmetic, calculating trajectories and probabilities with a precision that saved Allied lives by ending German ones. His legacy endures not just in the tactical doctrine he pioneered, but in the example he set, that excellence requires obsessive dedication, that innovation comes from understanding your enemy completely, and that success in warfare demands sacrifices most people cannot imagine. Walker gave everything, burning himself out in 3 years of combat that would have lasted most officers a lifetime. The 27-day patrol from January to February 1944 stands as testament to what one determined commander and his trained crews could accomplish through tactical innovation and relentless pressure. 6 U-boats destroyed, 3 in 15 hours, a record that defined the Battle of the Atlantic's final phase and helped ensure Allied victory in the war's most crucial campaign. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.